Most people assume that if they feel financially stuck, the problem must be their income because that's the most obvious explanation and the one everyone talks about. When money feels tight, the instinctive response is to think about raises, promotions, side hustles, or finding a higher paying job because earning more feels like the cleanest and most logical solution. But for a huge number of people who are doing everything responsibly and still not getting ahead, income is not the real constraint, even though it looks like one on the surface. Here's the situation that almost everyone in the middle class recognizes immediately, even if they've never put words to it before. You earn a decent salary, your bills are paid on time, you're not reckless with money, and yet every major decision in your life feels heavy and restrictive because moving, changing jobs, taking risks, or even imagining a different lifestyle feels complicated, expensive, or outright impossible. The strange part is that this feeling doesn't go away when your income goes up, and in many cases, it actually gets worse. My name is Alex, and I spend way too much time thinking about money, behavior, and why financial advice so often misses the real reason people feel stuck. If you're someone who earns a decent income but still feels boxed in by your financial situation, make sure to subscribe and give this video a thumbs up if it helps you see what's really going on. Because today we're talking about why housing, not income, quietly becomes the most powerful trap in modern personal finance. Here's what most people don't realize early enough. Housing is not just an expense, it's a long-term commitment that shapes nearly every other financial decision you make, often without you consciously noticing it. Once you lock yourself into a specific housing cost, whether that's rent or a mortgage, your entire financial life starts orbiting around that fixed obligation because everything else has to adjust to make that payment feel safe and sustainable. At first, housing decisions usually feel responsible and even empowering. Buying a home feels like progress, stability, and adulthood, while renting a nicer place feels like a reward for working hard and earning more. These choices don't feel dangerous because they're socially approved, financially normalized, and often encouraged by banks, employers, and even family members who see housing as a sign that you're doing well. The problem is not that these decisions are wrong in isolation, but that their long-term impact is rarely examined honestly. Once housing costs are set, they create a baseline that your income must constantly defend. Your job stops being just a source of opportunity and starts becoming a shield that protects you from missing a payment, losing stability, or disrupting your lifestyle. This subtle shift changes how you think about risk because the cost of making a mistake now feels much higher than it did before you were tied to a large fixed monthly obligation. Now, you might be thinking that this is just how life works and that everyone needs somewhere to live, so housing can't really be a trap. That's a fair reaction, and on the surface, it sounds reasonable. But this is where the difference between flexibility and comfort becomes critical, because housing doesn't just take money, it takes optionality, which is far more valuable than people realize until it's gone. Let's look at some simple math, because this becomes much clearer when you strip away the emotion and focus on numbers. Imagine someone earning $80,000 a year, which many people consider a solid, respectable income. After taxes, that might translate to roughly $60,000 of take-home pay, depending on where they live. Now imagine that their housing costs, whether rent or mortgage, utilities, and maintenance, consume 40% of that take-home pay, which is extremely common in many cities today. That means nearly half of their financial energy is locked into one non-negotiable expense before food, transportation, insurance, or savings even enter the picture. As a result, every other financial goal has to squeeze into whatever space is left, which creates constant pressure to maintain income at all costs. Even a temporary disruption, like a job change, relocation, or career experiment, starts to feel risky because the housing payment doesn't pause just because your life does. And this is where housing quietly becomes a behavioral trap rather than just a financial one. When a large portion of your income is committed to staying where you are, you become more conservative with your choices, not because you lack ambition, but because the downside feels too expensive. You turn down opportunities that might pay off long-term because they threaten short-term stability. And over time, that pattern compounds into a life that feels increasingly locked in. What makes this especially powerful is that rising income doesn't automatically fix the problem. When people earn more, they often upgrade their housing to match, either by buying a bigger home, moving to a nicer area, or taking on higher rent that feels justified by their new salary. On paper, they're doing better, but structurally, they've recreated the same trap at a higher level because the proportion of income tied to housing stays the same or even increases. This is why so many people earning six figures still feel financially constrained, anxious about job security, and hesitant to make changes despite objectively making good money. The issue isn't that they're irresponsible or bad with finances, it's that housing has quietly absorbed their flexibility, leaving them dependent on steady income to maintain a life that looks successful but feels fragile. There's also a psychological layer here that most people never connect to housing directly. Once you're locked into a high housing cost, your brain becomes hyper-focused on avoiding loss rather than creating upside. Losing your home, downsizing, or even imagining a move starts to feel like failure, even if it would objectively improve your long-term position. That emotional weight makes people cling to situations they've outgrown, simply because the cost of change feels too high. This is where it gets really interesting, because the housing trap doesn't just limit money, it limits imagination. When you can't easily change where you live, you also limit where you can work, who you can work for, and how you structure your time. Geographic flexibility disappears, career flexibility shrinks, and suddenly your life options feel narrower, even though you technically earn more than you ever have before. Now, you might be thinking that buying a home is still better than renting, because at least you're building equity instead of throwing money away. That argument is extremely common, and it's not entirely wrong, but it's also incomplete. Equity only matters if it actually gives you leverage or freedom, and for many people, their home equity is effectively locked away because accessing it requires selling, refinancing, or taking on more debt, all of which come with trade-offs that people are often unwilling or unable to accept. Meanwhile, the psychological cost of feeling anchored to one place continues to grow. People stay in jobs they dislike, cities that no longer fit them, and routines that drain their energy, simply because changing any of those things would disrupt their housing situation. Over time, this creates a strange contradiction where life looks stable on the outside, but feels increasingly constrained on the inside. The hardest part about the housing trap is that it doesn't announce itself clearly. There's no dramatic moment where you realize you've made a mistake, because everything seems fine day to day. Bills are paid, the house is there, and life continues. But slowly, almost invisibly, your choices become narrower, your tolerance for risk drops, and your future starts looking more like an extension of the present rather than something you actively shape. This doesn't mean that owning or renting is inherently bad, or that everyone should avoid committing to housing altogether. The real issue is committing too early, too heavily, or too rigidly without leaving room for change as your life evolves. Housing becomes a trap when it dictates your options instead of supporting them, and that line is crossed much more often than people realize. Once you understand this, the focus shifts away from obsessing over income and toward protecting flexibility. Instead of asking how to afford more house, the more important question becomes how much housing allows you to stay adaptable. That mindset change alone can dramatically alter how people approach career decisions, savings goals, and long-term planning. If this video made you rethink your relationship with housing, make sure to subscribe, because this channel is about understanding how money actually shapes behavior, not just how it looks on paper. And if you've ever felt like your life was locked in despite earning more than you thought you needed, you're not alone, and you're not doing anything wrong. You're just responding rationally to a structure that quietly limits freedom.